This woman ran up to the mob boss and said, "They're beating my father." Then he stood up and did something that shocked everyone. Watch until the end. Comment what you thought of this story, giving it a score from 0 to 10. I really want to know if you liked my story, and subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. An unforgiving April rain fell mercilessly on Chicago, turning the streets into dark mirrors that reflected the neon lights of the city that never sleeps. At Il Dominio, an exclusive Italian restaurant in the heart of the Gold Coast, the aroma of truffles and imported wines mingled with the discreet sound of conversations that decided fates and fortunes. Dante Moretti adjusted the platinum cufflinks on his Italian shirt while sipping a 1985 Barolo, his dark eyes scanning the room with the casualness of someone who had always controlled every detail around him. At 38, Dante carried on his shoulders the weight of an empire built on the fringes of the law, every move calculated, every word measured. His dark, always impeccably styled hair framed a face that could have been torn from a magazine, were it not for the almost imperceptible scar that cut through his left eyebrow, a reminder of a lesson learned too early about trusting the wrong people. The Neapolitan tailored suit cost more than many would earn in a year, but for Dante, it was just another piece of the armor he wore every day. On the other side of the city, in Bridgeport, Helen Parker was finishing another 16-hour shift at Chicago General Hospital. Her brown eyes, usually bright with the determination of someone who had made caring for others her life's mission, were red with exhaustion and worry. At 26, Helen had learned early on that life offered no guarantees, only opportunities for those brave enough to fight for them. Her brown hair, which she insisted on keeping simple and tied in a bun during her shifts, framed a face of natural beauty that the stained hospital scrubs couldn't diminish. As she pulled off her surgical gloves after another dawn spent saving lives society had forgotten, her phone buzzed in her pocket, the trembling voice of Mrs. Davis, the neighbor who looked after her father when she was at the hospital, cut through the line like a cold blade. "Helen, honey, you need to come quick. There are some men here at the garage. They're hurting your father, Arthur." Helen's world crumbled in an instant. Her father, Arthur Parker, was an honest mechanic who had dedicated his entire life to fixing old cars in a small garage inherited from his grandfather. He had never been in trouble, never owed anyone a favor, living only for his work and to be proud of the nurse daughter he had raised alone after his wife died when Helen was just 12. The race to Bridgeport was a blur of tears and despair, her heart pounding so hard she feared it might stop at any moment. When she arrived at the garage, the sight that greeted her was seared into her memory like a branding iron. Her father was on the floor, his face swollen and bloodied, while two enormous men kicked him with the coldness of someone doing it for the third time that day. "20 grand by Friday, old man," one of them said, his voice laced with a casual cruelty that made Helen feel sick. "Or next time, it won't be just a beating." Helen ran to protect her father without thinking of her own safety, and ended up taking a slap that threw her against a wall of tools. The taste of blood in her mouth mixed with the rage that grew in her chest like an uncontrolled flame. "He doesn't owe you anything!" she screamed, trying to place herself between the men and Arthur. "Oh yes, he does, princess." The other man laughed, running his hand down Helen's face in a way that made her feel dirty. "The loan your old man co-signed for his addict niece. Now it's his problem." It was then that Helen remembered the whispered conversations at the hospital, the stories that circulated among the nursing staff about a man who solved problems the police couldn't. "The Gold Coast Italian," they'd say, "someone you went to when there were no other options left." No one knew exactly who he was or where to find him, but everyone knew the restaurant where he appeared, Il Dominio, where Chicago's powerful went when they needed solutions to impossible problems. After the men left, leaving Arthur moaning on the garage floor, and Helen with a cut lip and purple bruises on her arms. She made the most desperate decision of her life. She helped her father up, cleaned the blood from his face with the gentleness of someone who had cared for patients for years, and whispered a promise she didn't know if she could keep. "I'll fix this, Dad. I promise." The journey to the Gold Coast was a journey between two completely different worlds. Helen watched from the bus window as the buildings grew taller, more elegant, as the streets became cleaner and the people better dressed. When she got off in front of Il Dominio, still in her stained hospital scrubs and with the marks of violence on her face, she felt like an intruder in a world clearly not made for people like her. The restaurant was exactly as she had imagined, elegant in an almost intimidating way, with imported marble, Murano glass, and waiters who moved with the precision of a rehearsed choreography. Conversations were conducted in low tones, and Helen could feel the weight of curious and disapproving glances turning towards her. But the pain in her heart was greater than the shame, the fear for her father stronger than the insecurity. That's when she saw him. Dante Moretti was sitting at a table in the back of the room, surrounded by men in expensive suits who hung on his every word. Even without knowing who he was, Helen knew instinctively that this was the man she was looking for. There was something in his posture, in the way he dominated the environment without needing to raise his voice, that radiated power and control. When their eyes met, Helen felt a strange electricity run through her body, a mixture of fear and something she couldn't identify. Dante had noticed the young woman the moment she walked into the restaurant. It was impossible not to notice someone so out of context in that environment, especially a woman with that natural beauty, evident even under the marks of violence. There was something in her brown eyes that intrigued him, a fierce determination that contrasted with her apparent vulnerability. When she started walking towards his table, ignoring the disapproving whispers of the other patrons, Dante felt something awaken within him, a curiosity he hadn't experienced in a long time. "They're beating my father," were the first words Helen managed to say when she stood before Dante's table. Her voice came out weaker than she would have liked, but loaded with such intense emotion that it made the powerful man before her slowly raise his eyes from his wineglass. The silence that followed seemed to last an eternity, with the men around the table watching the scene with a mixture of surprise and tension. Dante studied the face of the young woman before him, noticing every detail. The cut on her lip, the purple bruises beginning to show on her arms, the eyes red from crying and exhaustion, but most of all, the pure, raw courage that had brought her there. In 3 decades in the underworld, he had seen all kinds of desperate people knock on his door, but never someone like this woman. There was a dignity in her desperation, a nobility that could not be bought or faked. "Sit down," he said finally, his deep voice carrying an authority that made the other men at the table automatically move to make room. Helen hesitated for a moment, aware that she was crossing a line from which there might be no return, but the image of her bloodied father on the garage floor propelled her forward. As she sat, Dante noticed how her hands trembled slightly, how she tried to control her breathing, and he felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. The urgent need to protect someone. Helen felt the weight of all the men's gazes at the table as she tried to find the right words. The elegant atmosphere of Il Dominio seemed to suffocate her, but Dante Moretti's magnetic presence kept her focused. He gestured discreetly for the other men to move away, and in a few seconds she found herself alone with the most dangerous man in Chicago, studying every feature of his face as if she could read his soul through his dark eyes. "Tell me everything," Dante said, his voice low but filled with an authority that made Helen feel her words had real weight. She took a deep breath, trying to organize the thoughts that were jumbling in her mind, and began to narrate the events of the evening. She spoke of her honest mechanic father, of the addicted niece who had forged his signature on a loan from loan sharks, of the men who had invaded the garage as if they owned the world. With every word, Dante leaned further forward, his eyes never leaving Helen's face. "How did you find me?" he asked when she finished, genuinely intrigued. Few people knew his whereabouts, and certainly no public hospital nurse should have access to that information. Helen looked down, feeling her cheeks flush. "At the hospital where I work, people talk. They say you solve problems the police can't." Her voice was just a whisper, but Dante caught every word. "And you believe everything you hear?" The question caught Helen off guard. She raised her eyes to meet his, and for a moment she forgot where she was, who he was, all the dangers surrounding the situation. There was something hypnotic in the way Dante watched her, as if he were seeing parts of her that even she didn't know. "I had no other options," she answered honestly. "My father is all I have in the world. He raised me alone, worked his whole life to give me a profession, never hurt anyone. I'd do anything to protect him." Dante felt something stir deep in his chest upon hearing those words. It had been years since he had encountered someone capable of unconditional love, someone willing to sacrifice everything for another person. In his world, loyalty was bought, love was negotiated, and protecting someone always came with a price. But Helen spoke of her father with a pure devotion that reminded him of who he had been before building his empire in the shadows. "Which hospital do you work at?" he asked, changing the subject abruptly. Helen frowned, confused by the question. "Chicago General and the University of Illinois Hospital. I do shifts at both." Dante nodded slowly, storing this information. "How long have you been a nurse?" 5 years. I graduated from the University of Illinois, Chicago, paid for it with scholarships and a lot of work." There was pride in her voice, and Dante realized that every achievement in this woman's life had been hard-won. Without warning, Dante stood up from the table, his imposing presence instantly commanding the entire room. "Let's go," he said, extending his hand to Helen. She hesitated for a moment, aware that accepting that hand meant entering a world she might not be able to leave. But the image of her injured father propelled her forward, and she placed her small, work-calloused hand in Dante's large and surprisingly gentle palm. The touch was electric. They both felt the current that passed between them, an instant connection that caught them completely off guard. Dante, accustomed to always being in control of his reactions, felt momentarily disoriented by the intensity of what he experienced. Helen, for her part, had to make a conscious effort not to immediately withdraw her hand, startled by how her body reacted to the contact. Their exit from the restaurant was an event in itself. Dante walked with the confidence of someone who owned the world, while Helen tried not to look completely out of place next to a man who clearly commanded the respect and fear of everyone around him. The black BMW waiting for them on the curb was more luxurious than any car Helen had ever seen up close, and when Dante opened the door for her to get in, the unexpected courtesy made her question everything she thought she knew about men like him. During the drive to Bridgeport, a silence heavy with tension filled the car's interior. Helen watched out the window as the streets became gradually more familiar, simpler, more real. Dante, meanwhile, discreetly studied her profile reflected in the glass, noticing how her natural beauty intensified under the intermittent light of the street lamps. There was something magnetic about this woman that went far beyond physical appearance, an inner strength that intrigued him in a dangerous way. "Why are you doing this?" Helen asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Dante took a moment to answer because he himself wasn't sure of the answer. In more than 2 decades of building his empire, he had never personally involved himself in the problems of strangers. There were rules, hierarchies, protocols to follow, but something in this woman had awakened a protective instinct he thought he had buried forever. "Because you had the courage to come find me," he said finally, his voice softer than Helen had expected. "And because it's been a long time since I've met someone willing to risk everything for love." The words hung in the air between them, laden with meanings neither was ready to fully confront. When they arrived in Bridgeport, the difference between the two worlds became glaringly obvious. The narrow streets, the half-working streetlights, the simple houses huddled together, all contrasted violently with the luxury of the Gold Coast. But Dante observed everything with genuine interest, not with the disdain Helen expected to see. There was something almost nostalgic in his eyes, as if these streets reminded him of something lost in time. Arthur's garage was exactly as Helen had described it, small, honest, filled with carefully organized tools and old cars that were given new life under his skilled hands. Dante got out of the car and walked through the space with the curiosity of someone who appreciated a job well done, regardless of its simplicity. Helen watched nervously, trying to see her home through his eyes, preparing for the judgment that would surely come. "Your father built all this himself?" Dante asked, running a hand over a workbench that was clearly handmade. Helen nodded, surprised by his interest. "My grandfather started it in the 50s. Dad inherited everything and never stopped working. Even after Mom died, even when I was little and causing trouble, he never gave up." Dante stopped walking and turned to Helen, studying her expression as she spoke of her father. There was unconditional love in every word, a genuine gratitude that made him wonder when was the last time someone had spoken of him with half that affection. "Where is he now?" he asked, returning to the matter that had brought them there. "At home, recovering. Mrs. Davis, our neighbor, is looking after him." Helen hesitated for a moment before continuing. "He doesn't know I came to you. If he knew, he would have forbidden me. Dad is too proud to accept help, especially from—" She stopped, realizing she was about to say something potentially offensive. "From someone like me?" Dante completed with no trace of anger in his voice. Helen looked down, embarrassed, but he continued. "Your father is right to be cautious. Men like me charge prices that aren't always paid in cash." The statement made Helen quickly raise her eyes, a mixture of fear and determination shining in her pupils. "I'll pay any price," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor she tried to hide. Dante took a step towards her, and Helen felt her heart race in a way that had nothing to do with fear. He was tall enough that she had to lift her chin to meet his eyes, and when she did, the air between them seemed charged with electricity. "You have no idea what you're saying," he murmured, his voice husky, in a way that made something stir in Helen's stomach. The moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. 3 men emerged from the shadows, all wearing dark suits and expressions that left no doubt about their intentions. Dante didn't seem surprised at all, as if he had mentally summoned them. "Find out everything about the loan sharks who were here," he said, his voice returning to its tone of absolute command. "Names, addresses, who they work for, how much they charge, how long they've been operating in this area. I want a full report in 2 hours." Helen watched, fascinated, at Dante's transformation. The man who moments before had been looking at her with something close to tenderness had become a force of nature, radiating power and authority in an almost palpable way. The 3 men simply nodded and disappeared into the darkness with the efficiency of well-trained soldiers, leaving Helen alone again with the most dangerous man in Chicago in a mechanic's garage on the South Side. 2 hours later, Helen was sitting in her small kitchen, still trying to process everything that had happened. Dante had insisted on accompanying her home to meet Arthur personally, and the conversation between the 2 men had been a fascinating study in contrasts. Her father, despite his injuries and obvious mistrust, had received Dante with the dignity of someone who bowed to no one, while Dante had shown a genuine respect that surprised Helen. "I don't like the idea of my daughter getting involved in this," Arthur had said directly, without mincing words. Dante had nodded, understanding the man's concern perfectly. "I understand your position, Mr. Parker. If I had a daughter like Helen, I'd feel the exact same way. The answer had disarmed the mechanic for a moment, who clearly hadn't expected such honesty. Now, alone at home while her father rested in the next room, Helen replayed every moment of that surreal night. Her phone vibrated in her hands, an unknown number on the screen. When she answered, Dante's deep, unmistakable voice filled her simple kitchen like a physical presence. "The problem has been resolved," he said without preamble. "The men who hurt your father won't bother you again. Ever." Helen felt her legs go weak. "How did you—" "It's better you don't know the details," Dante interrupted, but his voice carried a kindness she hadn't expected. "The important thing is that you're safe now. The debt has been cancelled, and those responsible have been discouraged from continuing to operate in this region." The silence that followed was loaded with unspoken meanings, and Helen understood that there were things in Dante's world she preferred not to know. "I need to thank you in person," she said finally, surprised by her own courage. "And I need to know, what is the price you mentioned?" Dante took a long time to answer, and Helen could almost hear him thinking on the other end of the line. "Let's meet tomorrow to talk about it. There's a cafe in Wicker Park, corner of Darman and Milwaukee, 2 o'clock in the afternoon." Before she could protest or ask questions, the call ended. Helen spent a sleepless night, alternating between tending to her father's wounds and trying to understand what was happening to her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Dante's face, felt again the electricity that had passed between them when they touched. Remembered the way he had looked at her in the garage. It was wrong, she knew it. Men like Dante Moretti weren't interested in nurses from public hospitals. And even if they were, women like her shouldn't return that interest. The next day passed in a haze of anxiety and expectation. At the hospital, Helen tried to focus on her work, but her colleagues noticed something was different. "You're acting strange today," commented Jessica, her best friend among the nurses. "Did something happen?" Helen forced a smile, lying that she was just tired from the scare with her father. How could she explain that she had spent the night thinking about a dangerous man who had solved her problems with methods she preferred not to imagine? At 2 o'clock sharp, Helen was sitting in the cafe Dante had chosen, a small, discreet place that contrasted sharply with the elegance of Il Dominio. She had swapped her hospital scrubs for a simple blouse and jeans, but still felt inadequate, like an actress trying to play a role she hadn't rehearsed for. When Dante appeared at the door, wearing a dark sweater and casual pants that cost more than she earned in a month, Helen felt that knot in her stomach again, one she couldn't identify. He sat across from her without ceremony, and Helen noticed how his presence instantly transformed the atmosphere. There was a natural magnetism to Dante that made people around them glance discreetly in his direction, an aura of power that even casual clothes couldn't hide. "How's your father?" he asked, genuinely interested. "Better. The bruises are healing well, and he slept through the night for the first time in weeks." Dante nodded, satisfied. "And you? How are you handling all this?" The question's sincerity caught Helen off guard. Most people asked about her father, about the situation, but no one bothered to ask how she was processing the trauma. "Confused," she answered honestly. "I don't understand why you helped us. I don't understand what you want from me in return. And I don't understand why I'm here, knowing I should be as far away from you as possible." Dante's low laugh surprised her. There was no malice in it, just a genuine amusement that humanized his hard features. "At least you're honest," he said. "Most people would lie about all 3 points." Helen felt her cheeks flush, but she kept her gaze fixed on his. "Then answer me honestly too. Why did you help us?" Dante was silent for a long moment, studying her face as if searching for the right words. "Because it's been a long time since I've seen someone willing to sacrifice everything for love. Because you walked into my world without fear, driven only by the need to protect the one you love." And because there's something about you that reminds me of who I used to be before I became who I am." The confession was made in a low, almost intimate voice, and Helen felt something stir deep in her chest. "And what do you want from me?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. Dante leaned slightly forward, his intense dark eyes fixed on hers. "I want to know you," he said simply. "I want to understand how someone can maintain so much purity in such a dirty world. I want to find out if it's possible for someone like me to be near someone like you without contaminating everything I touch." Helen felt her heart accelerate dangerously. There was something in the way Dante spoke, a carefully controlled vulnerability that contrasted with the image of absolute power he projected. "And what if it's not possible?" she asked, surprising herself with her own courage. "What if you do contaminate me, as you say?" "Then I disappear from your life before it's too late," Dante replied. But there was something in his eyes that suggested this possibility terrified him more than any enemy he had ever faced. "But I want to try. I want to see if I can be better when I'm near you." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a tall, thin man who approached the table without ceremony. Helen immediately noticed how Dante tensed, his posture instantly shifting to something more defensive. "Marco," he said, his voice as cold as ice, "I didn't know you frequented Wicker Park." The man, Marco, smiled in a way that sent a shiver of fear down Helen's spine. "Dante, my old friend," Marco said, completely ignoring Helen. "I hear you're getting involved in very small business lately. Street-level collectors, family problems. It's not really your style." There was a clear provocation in his words, and Helen could feel the tension building between the two men like a gathering storm. Dante stood up slowly, his height intimidating, even in a casual setting. "My business is none of your concern, Marco. It never has been." The threat in his voice was palpable, but Marco just kept smiling. "Of course not. But when you start frequenting cafes in Wicker Park with pretty nurses, people start to talk, and when people talk, information gets to the wrong ears." Helen felt her blood run cold. Without fully understanding what was happening, she knew instinctively that she had become a target simply by being there. Dante, noticing her fear, placed a protective hand on her shoulder, a gesture that did not go unnoticed by Marco. "Be careful, Dante," he said, his voice carrying a thinly veiled threat. "Men like us can't afford to have obvious weaknesses." "You're making a mistake, Marco," Dante replied, each word carefully controlled. "A very big mistake." Marco shrugged as if the threat were irrelevant. "We'll see," he said, casting one last look at Helen that made her feel exposed and vulnerable. "I hope your new distraction is worth the consequences, my friend." After Marco left, leaving a heavy atmosphere in his wake, Dante sat down again, but Helen could see that something had fundamentally changed. There was a tension in his shoulders, a hardness in his eyes that wasn't there before. "Who was he?" she asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. "Someone who should have stayed in the past," Dante said, avoiding looking directly at her. "Helen, maybe it's better if you forget we ever met. Marco's right about one thing. Men like me can't afford to have weak spots. And you?" He finally raised his eyes to meet hers. "You would be my biggest weakness." The confession hung between them like a bomb about to explode. Helen felt tears well up in her eyes, not of sadness, but of an intense frustration she couldn't name. "And what if I don't want to forget?" she asked, her voice trembling but determined. "What if I want to face the consequences?" Dante closed his eyes for a moment, as if fighting an internal battle. When he opened them again, Helen saw something that made her momentarily forget to breathe. Love was being born there, dangerous and impossible, but undeniably real. "Then God help us," he murmured, "because I don't have the strength to stay away from you." The weeks following the meeting at the cafe were a whirlwind of contradictory emotions for Helen. Dante kept his silent promise not to disappear from her life, but his presence became a constant tension between desire and an awareness of the danger he represented. He would appear in the most unexpected places, in the hospital parking lot as she left her night shift, at the corner bakery when she bought bread for breakfast, in the park where she sometimes walked to relieve work stress. He never approached her directly when other people were around, but Helen always felt his eyes on her, a protective and unsettling presence at the same time. The flowers started arriving in the second week, discreet but elegant arrangements that appeared at the hospital reception with her name on them, without a card or identification. Helen knew who sent them, just as she knew that accepting these gifts put her in an increasingly compromising position. But there was something in the delicacy of the gestures that completely disarmed her. They weren't expensive, showy flowers meant to impress, but carefully chosen arrangements that spoke directly to her heart. Simple daisies that reminded her of her childhood in the countryside, white orchids that echoed the purity he saw in her. Her father, Arthur, noticed the changes in his daughter long before she admitted to herself what was happening. There was a different sparkle in her eyes, an anxiety that wasn't there before, a new habit of constantly checking her phone for messages that always arrived at just the right moments. "Helen," he said one evening as she arranged the latest flowers in a makeshift vase, "this man who helped us. You're getting involved with him, aren't you?" The question caught Helen off guard, and she felt her cheeks flush as she tried to formulate a response that didn't sound like a complete lie. "Dad, it's complicated." "It's not complicated," Arthur interrupted, his voice heavy with paternal concern. "You either are or you aren't. And from the way you've been acting, the way your eyes light up when you talk about him, I'd say you're already more involved than you should be." Helen sat down heavily in a kitchen chair, the weight of the past few weeks finally crashing down on her shoulders. "I didn't plan this, Dad. When I went to find him, I just wanted to protect you. But he's not what I expected. There's so much kindness hidden behind all that hardness, so much loneliness in his eyes, and the way he looks at me, as if I'm something precious he doesn't deserve to touch." Her voice broke slightly, and Arthur came closer to place a hand on his daughter's shoulder. "My girl," he said softly, "I understand you see kindness in him. Any man who cares enough to protect a family he barely knows has some decency in his heart, but men like him, they live in a world where violence is the solution for everything. Are you sure you want to be a part of that?" Helen looked up to meet her father's eyes, seeing all the wisdom of someone who had lived long enough to understand the complexities of human nature. "I don't know, Dad," she answered honestly. "I just know that when I'm with him, I feel like I can be stronger, braver, and when he's not around, the world somehow seems less colorful." Arthur sighed deeply, recognizing the signs of a passion that had already passed the point of no return. "Then you need to have an honest conversation with him about where this is going. Because in the end, you two will have to choose between the love you feel for each other and the worlds that can't mix." The following night, Helen received a message that would change everything. "I need to see you urgently. Meet me at the Lakeshore Drive overlook in an hour. Come alone." There was something in the urgency of the text that made her heart race in a different way. It wasn't the good anxiety she felt when Dante wanted to see her, but a primal fear that something terrible had happened. When she arrived at the overlook, she found Dante leaning against the guardrail, looking out at the sea of lights that stretched out below them. Even from behind, Helen could see the tension in his shoulders, the rigidity of someone fighting forces greater than himself. When he turned to see her, Helen's heart sank. There was a deep sadness in his eyes, a resignation she had never seen before. "Marco made me an offer I can't refuse," he said without preamble, his voice heavy with a weariness that seemed to come from his soul. He wants to form a partnership, unite our territories, split the profits. To refuse would mean war, and war would mean innocent people getting hurt, including you. Helen felt the world spin around her, but she forced herself to stay standing, to process the implications of what he was saying. "And if you accept?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Dante stepped closer to her, reaching out to touch her face with a gentleness that violently contrasted with the harshness of his words. "If I accept, I'll have to prove you're not a weakness. I'll have to distance myself completely, make it clear to everyone that we mean nothing to each other." His voice broke slightly on the last word, and Helen saw the pain he was feeling mirrored in her own feelings. "There's a third option," Helen said suddenly, surprising them both with the determination in her voice. "You can leave this life. You can choose to start over, far away from all of this." Dante shook his head, a sad smile playing on his lips. "Helen, my love, you don't understand. You don't just leave this life by deciding to leave. Men like me carry secrets that other people would kill to protect. I know operations, names, locations. I'm a living threat to a lot of powerful people." "Then we run," Helen said, the idea taking shape in her mind as she spoke. "We leave Chicago, leave the country if we have to. We start a new life somewhere no one knows us." Dante watched her with a mixture of admiration and despair, seeing the woman he loved willing to sacrifice everything for an uncertain future by his side. "And your father, your career, your whole life?" "My whole life is worth nothing without you in it," Helen replied, the words coming from her heart before her mind could censor them. "Dad will understand. He wants my happiness above all else, and as for my career, I can work as a nurse anywhere in the world." Dante closed his eyes, fighting the temptation to believe that such a future was possible. It was then that Helen made the decision that would change everything. She stepped closer to Dante, placed her hands on his face and forced him to look into her eyes. "Dante Moretti, I love you. I love your hidden kindness, your strength, your ability to protect those you love. I even love your flaws and your fears, and if you love me too, then we find a way out, together." The confession hung between them like a bridge over a chasm. Dante studied every feature of Helen's face, memorizing the determination in her eyes, the courage that radiated from every pore of her skin. "I love you," he said finally, the words coming out like a prayer. "I love you so much it feels like you're the only real thing in a world of illusions. I love you so much that I'm willing to die for you, or better yet, to live for you." The kiss that followed was a promise, a pact sealed between two souls who had found in each other something worth fighting for. When they parted, they both knew there was no turning back. They had chosen love over safety, the uncertain future over the controlled present. 6 months later, in a small coastal town in southern Florida, Helen and Dante were quietly celebrating the first anniversary of their first meeting. Dante had managed to negotiate his exit from the criminal world through a complex deal that involved revealing information about rivals in exchange for federal protection and a new identity. Helen, now using Dante's name as his wife, worked as a nursing coordinator at the local hospital, bringing all the experience she had gained in the big city to the community. Arthur had moved with them, setting up a small garage that quickly became the best in the region. At night, as they sat on the simple porch of the house they had rented, watching the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors, the three of them knew they had made the right choice. Love had conquered fear, hope had overcome despair, and two people from opposite worlds had proven that it was possible to build a bridge over any abyss when there is enough courage to take the first step. Helen placed a hand on her still flat belly, where a new life was beginning to grow, and smiled at Dante. In his eyes, he saw everything he had ever been looking for: peace, unconditional love, and the promise of a future built on solid foundations of honesty and mutual dedication. They had lost a lot along the way, but they had gained something infinitely more valuable, the chance to be truly happy, against all odds, against all prognoses, against everything the world had tried to put between them. Love had won, as it always should. If you liked this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring you videos every day that will make your life happier. Comment what you thought of my story, giving it a score from 0 to 10, and thank you very much.